Hi, I'm Toby Russell, co-CEO at Shift. Shift is an online marketplace for cars. We'll talk a little bit about that, as well as a couple of other things. But quick intro on me. Stuff I try to do, just as a hello. Try to be a good dad, try to stay active, take my team surfing and stuff. And then I dabble in learning how to change stuff. And I'm going to tell a couple of stories of places that I've had a chance to experience a little bit of change in case it might be useful to you. I always like to start out by saying, hey, it's easy to forget that we're in the center of an incredibly transformative and disruptive place. I mean, the digital revolution that so many of us are at the center of leading really is following on a series of other major changes, like the invention of fire. And it is like that kind of transformation, coming off of the Industrial Revolution, the agrarian one. We're in the midst of fundamental change, and we each have the opportunity to really transform the spaces that we live in, indeed to disrupt them. And so people say, what do you think of as disruption? And usually what I talk about, and we'll talk about like kind of a recipe for how you go about doing that and some of the means you can do it in a marketplace, but it's not about doing the same thing, like a little bit more. It's about fundamentally reinventing and applying usually new technology and approach, albeit oftentimes solving the same problem. The Henry Ford quote of, if I ask my customers what they want, they'll say a faster horse. But what they're really looking for is safe and reliable transportation, applying the internal combustion engine to a problem that had previously been solved with an animal. So you transform from like the horse to a car, you transform from a book to a Kindle, you transform from a CD or a record to iTunes, taking the technology and rethinking, reimagining the thing. It's not about doing the thing a little bit better, it's about fundamentally transforming what it is. And that's a lot of what we get to do in the marketplace space, is connecting people, oftentimes with goods, services in a fundamentally different way and using technology. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some experiences that I've gotten to have in that place, what's worked and frankly what hasn't worked. So, quick census. How many people here have heard of Taxi Magic? Raise your hand. We got 3, including Sanders. Sanders was at Taxi Magic. We got 3. How many people have heard of Uber? Yeah, like a lot more, right? So the story here is co-founded and led a company called Taxi Magic. We actually were, I jokingly say, the Netscape, as it were, of the Uber space. Why? A full 2 years before Uber was doing anything, we were building Java apps for BlackBerries to enable people to push a button on a mobile device and get access to the marketplace that we created of taxis. So we'd integrate to commuter dispatch systems and get people on the ground transportation. And people loved it, particularly here in San Francisco in the very beginning. It was awesome. You could like skip the queue if you were like calling in. I don't know if you guys remember this. There was a time, like in 2007, 2008, there were taxis in San Francisco. There were about 5, and all of them were terrible. But the biggest reason it was hard is you couldn't get one. And so people loved the idea of being able to go on a BlackBerry and then eventually an iPhone, push a button, jump the queue, have the car come. They loved the idea that like you could see it on a map, you could pay for it with a credit card electronically. All that stuff was great. But here was the problem. Periodically, the taxi wouldn't show up. And I jokingly say that that just totally fucks the value prop. Like, no taxi, no magic, you're just done. And the thing is, what would happen is the consumer would blame us. They'd be like, hey, Taxi Magic, you messed this thing up. And I'm kind of having this moment, right, of like, well, wait a minute. The airlines that you book on Expedia are constantly late, but you don't blame Expedia. But in this case, you're blaming us. Why is that? And they're like, oh, you've created the marketplace. I'm thinking of you as the provider, even though someone else is providing your service. And so the insight, the aha, was, whoa, what we did was we created what we thought was an amazing experience, but we only did the software piece, and we were dependent on others for the full experience. And that breakdown happened because we couldn't fundamentally change the taxis. But what Uber did, and really what Sidecar, and then Lyft, and then Uber stole from those folks did, was they reinvented the supply. Was they used technology to bring online a new form of supply and one over which they had more control. What's the difference between an Uber and a taxi? Fundamentally, a taxi could take somebody hailing off the street and an Uber couldn't. Why? Because what Uber was doing was illegal, but like let's set that aside for a little bit. They began to get control over their supply chain, even though they didn't necessarily own those assets. So that's very clever and a really great thing to do. The net of it was they thought end-to-end experience and they reinvented. And so there's a bit of a theme there, and that is you start with, say, like an analog industry. This is the equivalent of the horse, the book, the CD, as it were. Oftentimes the temptation is to just digitize it. hey, let's put a website on front of that thing, whether this would be like an online taxi, a yellowcab.com. But the real thing you need to do is go beyond and reimagine it. Control the entire experience. And that's ultimately what Uber ended up doing. I'd arguably say Taxi Magic was somewhere in between that, their digital and reimagined thing. But the net of it is that you can't just slap a website on the analog thing, especially if you're creating a new marketplace. You've got to have either a different supply or control over that experience of your supply. Really, really critical in creating a reinvention in the marketplace space. And so the way I usually coach on doing that, of course, and this may sound blindingly obvious to most of you who are product folks, is you got to go deep and understand your user need. Again, your user will tell you, I want a faster horse, but what they're really looking for is more reliable transportation. And then you have to apply create a novel technical solution to solve that problem. And that's really the fundamental equation that you're constantly looking for, and that I would encourage you to ask your teams and push your teams as you're leading folks in product journeys to do disruption, and particularly in the marketplace space, saying, hey, what is our user really looking for? And how do we use a novel technical approach to deliver on that? In Uber's case, they're saying what our user's really looking for is reliable pickup, clarity on timing, and electronic payment. Let's figure out how to do that. And Taxi Magic solved all those things, but we had a breakdown in our implementation because we couldn't guarantee the end-to-end experience. And so that's what you want to be looking for. So the next space my last co-founder jumped into is then auto. We're now doing a marketplace in the auto space. And it's the same kind of analogy. We see a world whereby there's a lot of analog dealerships. It's like physical dealerships, like people would go from place to place and shop. I don't know if anybody's been up through Petaluma. How many people here are from the Bay Area here? So we have some good mix. So if you head up north of Marin into like Petaluma, you see like all these dealerships, physical locations. The most recent change in that space was like, hey, let's slap digital, a technology on front of that. Example, companies like Car Gurus are essentially a digital version, a listing of those things, but it's not a full stack experience. You can't actually buy a car from those listing sites. And so we said, hey, if we want to do something in this space, how might we approach something different? And learning from Taxi Magic was, yeah, we could sort of put a website on top of a bunch of other people's experience, but that doesn't actually transform the experience. Like if you're in the room and saying, no, I think the used car salesman experience is fantastic, then I respect that. That's cool. But most people are like, yeah, kind of not. Like there's a huge opportunity at transforming in that space. And when I first got into the taxi business, people were like, are you kidding? You're going to be a taxi operator? It was like reviled, and now it's like super cool. Guess what? Same thing for, there's usually a recipe like when there's an industry that's like reviled, and then you're like, no, there's an opportunity there because there's a bad user experience to be transformed. The core user need, technical reinvention. And so we've looked to reimagine that thing, creating a two-sided marketplace is the concept. And a lot of people would say, wow, you guys are crazy. Like you're actually taking on moving around cars. So just a quick background on this thing. You can, in the Shift world, what we thought was you would want to be able to see the cars like you might on a Car Gurus or in a Taxi Magic or an Uber, but then actually be able to buy them, get them, and as an end-to-end way. We source cars from individuals, like 80 or 90% of the vehicles we get are from one consumer, and we're getting those back to another consumer. So the whole thing is, hey, how do you match those two sides of the marketplace? And the idea was not, hey, let's just throw it out to the users to do it all on their own and whatnot, but let's actually facilitate that transaction, make sure we're covering the end-to-end experience so we don't fall into the trap that we did at Taxi Magic, which is be at the mercy of someone else's experience and be a bolt-on so that you're not able to actually transform the experience. Now, we're not the only ones doing this. There's other players out there, and there's a bunch of people working on this. So I would use this not in a story of Shift, but more as a conceptual idea. We actually send somebody out, physically take the car that you want to buy to you, and then let you buy it on the spot with an iPad app. Because what we heard from users was it's not just enough to like send me to a dealership. Like I actually want to see the car, and that's a physical thing. It's hard when you're dealing with physical goods because people actually want to interact with that thing. If you're selling shoes, you got to find a way to get them the shoes to try on. If you're selling cars, you got to get them the car to be able to check that thing out. And so we've built a software logistics system to enable that and a mobile point of sale to enable that. The thesis being using novel technical ways to be able to connect those dots in a differentiated way. And so I'll give like 3 takeaways and then jump to any Q&A that people might have. And that is, first, as you're building your marketplace and you're thinking about reimagining, be really cognizant of that end-to-end experience. Don't let yourself be at the mercy of a supplier or a part of your value chain where there's a breakdown in experience. It's okay to like outsource, so to speak, in lots of different areas, but if it compromises your experience, that's the thing to be really careful about. That's literally the difference between Uber and Taxi Magic. And so that's one of those, like, learn from my mistake on that thing. Don't get caught in the trap of having a supplier or a supply chain that turns you into, puts you at their mercy and then hurts your user experience. The second thing, don't be afraid to build beyond software. Like when we started Taxi Magic, one of the big things that I thought about was we were pure play software. We're like, those Uber guys, they're going into operations, they've got drivers, they're putting in GMs in local markets. Like, that's crazy. We were literally like a 30-person software company, just totally pure software. I'm like, that's what we want to do. And we watched. They were willing to say, no, we will learn different disciplines. We will engage in completely different things beyond just software development in order to do this thing. And I actually would make an argument that this is kind of the next generation of disruption. It's about being able to walk and chew gum. Be ready to, if you're in biotech, do software plus biotechnology. If you're in transportation, software plus logistics. If you're in you name it, pharmaceutical, software plus pharmacy. Like there's a multidisciplinary management skill that is needed in the next generation of disruption. On one hand, embrace that and say, yes, I'm willing to go beyond software. So you got to be able to run a great software company. You also have to be able to run a great operations, logistics, biotech, you name it, medical service delivery company, because that is the thing. To take on the next stage of industries, you're going to have to be able to do both oftentimes. But do it in the service of the end-to-end experience. And finally, don't undershoot. Don't underestimate what you can do. When we first got into the taxi industry, everybody said, oh, it's highly regulated. You're never going to be able to change that thing. And our mistake was not believing that we could transform it. Our mistake was not going far enough. And that is the industry that I see in that thing is fundamentally transformed. People have told me, hey, you're getting into auto dealerships, like highly regulated licenses, financing and whatnot. And I'm like, no, like that thing, the opportunity is tremendous. Even in a regulated industry, don't be afraid of that thing. You can transform it far more than you would imagine. You just got to learn how to work back from the core needs. Regulators as user, end user as user, and come up with a novel technical solution. So fodder for thought. Wanted to throw that out there, and then leave like 5-7 minutes for questions or any thoughts or anything that might be on you guys' minds. Yeah, can you just say your name and what your question is?
Yeah, so I'm Rob from BitMob,
and
the question is around your pricing model.
Yeah.
You guys
Pricing model in the taxi world or in the Shift world? Yeah, so for Shift, what we do is on both seller and buyer side, we have a whole data science team that finds algorithms, and then we just look to price cars at what is a fair clearing price in the market. And we do that both on the seller side and the buyer side. So we basically, we have Terrence here from CarMax. They invented the concept, I believe, of the no haggle price I don't know about that. Well, we're all working on this thing. So we our pricing model on the buyer side is we don't have like a haggle concept. It's all driven by algorithms, and that's part of the thesis of the end-to-end experience, that a user wants to be able to, frankly, not have to fight with a used car dealer, and that was part of the thesis. So you do have to come up with, and it's like, it turns out it's like a non-trivial problem, because when you're trying to, some people have seen this in places like ThreadUp or Threadless. A lot of things like pricing clothes is a similar problem, and that is you're dealing with unique SKUs with lots of different variation. So it's a non-trivial problem to be able to price a vehicle, because you'll get a thing with like we had our head of pricing actually talk through. He's like, first you have to create the concept of an object of a vehicle. Like, what is a vehicle? And he's like, can a sedan have a trunk? Can a sedan have a bed like a truck would have? It turns out yes. You're like, so you have to first create the concept of the car, and then you have to build out options pricing and a bunch of other stuff. But we sort of use a variety of data sets and do that both on the seller and the buyer side to try and predict a market price.
I'm Quinn from Autotech Ventures. Cool. So, question for you about the end-to-end experience. What motivated you guys to go all the way from consumer on one end to consumer buyer on the other end? Why not stop at wholesale on the, let's call it the demand side? So why not take the approach of, say, an ACV auctions or one of the other players in that space, and start there, and then expand into kind of selling into a consumer eventually, and disintermediate some of those other players? Why not kind of de-risk and start with that?
It's a really great question. So the core Quinn's question is, hey, you're building a marketplace. Why did you choose to take on two sides of the marketplace simultaneously, as opposed to control supply and focus on demand, or vice versa, control demands, focus on supply? Candidly, that's actually a really smart strategy. Is like, if you're building a marketplace, oftentimes it is better to just be able to focus on one or the other. The short answer was the experience. There is, you talk to other folks doing this, folks like a Carvana, they basically will buy the vast majority of their vehicles from auction. We have a thesis that those are not the best vehicles in nature. The true experience is that people want cars that other people were just driving. There's a bunch of, in my opinion, negative selection on vehicles that end up at auction. Why? That car was driven by somebody who didn't want it. They gave it to a dealer who couldn't sell it, who put it out on their network, who wouldn't buy it, who then put it up to a broader set of brokers who wouldn't buy it, who took it to an auction where it might have gone 2 or 3 times around. Layers of negative selection beget bad inventory. And so what we've found, statistically speaking, is the car coming from user going to user is the best car in nature. And so, and also we're like Silicon Valley consumer. We're like, hey, we want to go consumer to consumer. We actually believe in the idea of people being able to exchange vehicles, and that's kind of the end game, as opposed to trying to work our way through a whole other ecosystem. That is a very long way of saying, once again, wanted to control our supply, wanted to control our user experience. And so when you go out, and it's simpler and it's easier, just as it's easier to go to the taxi cab industry that already had aggregated up drivers, already had aggregated up vehicles, and plug into that, as opposed to build our own supply, which is what Uber and Lyft and others did. That the thing that we were describing is definitely easier, but you get a worse user experience. And that's the game, is like, you always have to balance what's going to actually get the end-to-end experience that people want versus the easy thing, which is easy to do. And people oftentimes come to me like, hey, rental companies are going and they're giving like huge fleets of vehicles. Like, why don't you guys go after those? And I'm like, once again, high mileage vehicles with low option packages that are relatively new means they're high priced. That means it's not what the end consumer wants. They want the car that you're driving, that you bought new, you've driven for 3 to 5 years, and that you're now ready to hand off. And we want to facilitate that exchange. So it comes back to that core thesis of end-to-end experience is really critical, and not letting yourself be, quote, beholden to the subpar experience that you get when other people are providing your supply.
How do you think about customer acquisition and building a powerful brand when what you're selling is such a episodic purchase, maybe once every 5 years or more?
Yeah, that's a super tough question. The question is, hey, how do you build a brand in a place where you've got really infrequent customer engagement? I'm just going to be totally blunt. 2 answers. 1, I think we suck at brand. So working on that, and we're an engineering and product company, so we've done the typical thing, which is, wow, we're going to build a product and focus on that, and then eventually we're going to start building out brand and thinking like marketers and get there. So the step 1 to the question is, hey, we're investing in brand, and at the core of it is user experience. We believe our experience is our brand, and you get word of mouth. There is a fundamental challenge of, yes, in an infrequent purchase, it is a real challenge because you don't get that same kind of like multiple bites at the apple with someone, but you have to think longer term. So you can build customers for life. The average consumer will buy a car every 2 to 3 years. Why? Because people own 2 to 3 cars, and they'll buy one every, call it 5 years. So you're going to get a bite at that apple every couple 3 years. It's a considered purchase. So you have to think not as a brand builder. You have to think not in terms of just, hey, this is transactional, like people are buying food, but you have to think this person bought a car. They're now going to buy a car again in 2 years, and you're building a user base. Over time, we're looking at, and this is not unique to us. Like, there are auto dealers and stuff that have thought about this in the past, thinking about the full life cycle. So the buy, the ownership phase, and then the sale of the vehicle. And so we're working right now at the bookends of that transaction, and there's a big in between that we are developing out, the ability to support people all the way through that journey. But it is thinking about a long-term life cycle. So you have to think about your customer, not typically as in like, hey, I've just got to capture them for the next Thursday's meal, but for this is going to be you got to build out a brand and a relationship over many years. And that is, that's time and capital intensive, no doubt. Wait, bunch of people. If you start here.
When to integrate into an industry and when to disrupt it.
Yeah.
Critical mass, super critical for marketplaces. It's really hard to build network effect or critical mass if you're going to try to control the end-to-end experience. Is it a phase strategy when to integrate, where you unlock the supply and the demand and get the liquidity going with the larger mission of doing end-to-end? Otherwise, you might not see a day where this might just disappear because you have limited runway.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And that's something we struggle with a lot, especially doing a two-sided marketplace, is that we basically see that every year we switch from one side to the other side of the marketplace. And I joke, I kid you not, I'll be like, 2015, year of supply, 2016, year of demand, 2017, year of supply, 2018, year of demand, 2019, year of supply. And you jump back and forth on both sides of those. And I'd say, start with do identify who is truly your end user. And for us, we went back and forth. Is like the seller of the vehicle or the buyer of the vehicle the end user? Like, who is your true end user? And ultimately, we netted out with, it's a secret, I can't tell you. But what we essentially do is you say, hey, what's going to create that experience, and work back from that experience. If you can integrate into an industry and deliver the experience you want, great. Like, that's cool. Like, you don't have to be Uber and rebuild the whole thing. Expedia integrated into an industry and built an experience they wanted for quite a while. And so you can make a lot of headway doing that, particularly where there's a structural or fundamental gap. And so you can do a really good job on that thing. But if you want to be truly like a managed marketplace, you want a strategy to be able to layer in the reinvention of that experience. So if you can do it with an aggregator, like, that's awesome. Eventually you'll get disrupted, because like, if you did it fast, anybody else will be able to do that. And eventually you'll need to get to some sort of proprietary, call it supply or proprietary demand. And you want to be working on both of those over time. But that's like a long-term strategy thing. I'd say start with just the essence of what creates a great experience. And if you're delivering a great experience, it gets back to that core question around brand. Your brand is your experience. So you just have to hammer away at that and then run with that as long as you can. And you just figure out where in nature you can not have to build a lot of extra stuff and deliver a great experience, and then come back to it where you need to keep deepening. There were a couple other questions I want to make sure we can get to, folks. Yeah.
I'm looking from Autotech, and in the earlier slide, you mentioned evolution from horse to car.
Yeah.
It was very interesting because this week, Kara Swisher from New York Times wrote about an article that owning a car will become owning a horse.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's your thought on the article?
So I think it's a great question. You can imagine being in the auto industry right now, you get a lot of questions of, wait, but won't self-driving cars change everything? And the answer is twofold. Yes, I think automated vehicles will fundamentally change the landscape of transportation. The question is how and in what time period. I think there is a time period during which basically like everyone will drive in automated, like fully autonomous vehicles. That will happen. It's just a question of when. I don't personally believe that's going to be like within the next decade. I think we'll see we'll see special purpose use on campuses and in certain areas. Basically, a replacement of fixed route transportation. So think buses, trains. A lot of the fixed route, not on demand, but fixed route, is the stuff that'll get hit first in relatively dense areas. Then it will become on demand transportation that will get hit in, again, relatively dense areas. Eventually, you'll see rural transportation taken over by that when it's a fleet managed vehicle. So I also think in parallel, though, as that's happening over probably 30 years, you're going to see a mix of fleet-based, subscription-based, and personally owned vehicles. And this is like the mini I can't resist Shift pitch. Shift is like the only way you would buy a car if it is a self-driving car. Why? Our whole thesis is you go online, you push a button, the car comes to you. Like the driver, the person that we have to put in there, just as for Uber is like, wow, the person that we have to put in that car is a challenge. Like a world where the car could drive itself, as long as you believe that some people somewhere still want to own a vehicle, like we're like, love that idea. And so I think that's actually an incredible insight that innovation will happen. It's a question of how broad and how quickly. And I think that like everybody should be ready for that thing. I'm getting the time's up signal. I'm happy to like catch up really quick afterwards if that works. I'm kind of like saying, like looking at him, and I think he's telling me to cut. All right, cool. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.